Theodore Roosevelt was one of the most influential people of the early 20th century. His leadership style, his reforms, and his personality shaped an America that was rapidly becoming a world power. His legacy lives on as one of the greatest leaders in American history. Roosevelt was born in 1858 in New York City to Theodore Roosevelt Sr. and his wife Martha Bullock Roosevelt. Roosevelt Sr. was a prominent and wealthy New York philanthropist. Although blessed with a quick mind, Roosevelt Jr. was not blessed with a strong body. At school, he constantly had to deal with drubbings by schoolmates. He also was stricken with severe asthma, which tortured him throughout his childhood. Nights were spent fighting for breath. However, the amounts of these attacks waned, and by college they were almost non-existent. To deal with his weak self, Roosevelt devoted himself to physical exercise, especially boxing. He managed to make himself fit by the time he left to go to Harvard. Theodore Sr. had a tremendous influence on young Theodore and was a lifelong source of inspiration. Of him, Roosevelt wrote, "My father, Theodore Roosevelt, was the best man I ever knew. He combined strength and courage with gentleness, tenderness, and great unselfishness." Early in life, young Theodore took a strong interest in the natural sciences, which lasted his entire life. When he was 8, young Roosevelt saw a dead seal in a New York marketplace. He managed to acquire the seal's skull and with 2 of his cousins started the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. Their collections of bones, stones, dead mice, birds, frogs, and other items were kept in a dresser drawer. A maid once threw out a litter of mice. This incident greatly upset young Roosevelt, who wrote in his diary, "The loss to science, oh, the loss to science." In the years of his childhood, Roosevelt devoted much of his time to the natural sciences. His intention was to become a natural scientist when he entered Harvard University in the autumn of 1876. He later reminisced, "That seal filled me with every possible feeling of romance and adventure." While in college, Theodore had several life-changing experiences. First, his father, the man he respected and loved more than anyone else, died in February of 1878. Secondly, he met Alice Lee, who would become his first wife. She was a member of a socially prominent Boston family. The two met while Theodore was in his junior year, and they were married on Theodore's 22nd birthday, October 27, 1880. In 1881, at only 23 years of age, Roosevelt was elected to the New York State Legislature. Although very young for his position, Roosevelt gradually gained great respect in legislature and was well known for his opposition to corrupt politics. In 1884, he introduced an important bill into the New York State Assembly, the Reform Charter Bill. This bill concentrated power of the New York City government in the mayor instead of the many aldermen who commonly abused their power. Roosevelt's great advocacy of this bill and his floor speeches earned him laudatory headlines in prominent newspapers. The New York World reported, "Roosevelt on a rampage, whacking the heads off Republican office holders in the city." The New York Sun said, "Mr. Roosevelt's hard hits, making a lively onslaught on New York's aldermen." And the New York Herald reported, "Tammany defeated, Mr. Roosevelt's brilliant assault on corruption." The bill became known as the Roosevelt Bill and was soon passed, but in the midst of his success, tragedy struck. In February of 1884, Roosevelt's first daughter was born, named Alice after his first wife. 2 days later, Alice Lee, Roosevelt's wife, died from Bright's disease. That same night, his mother, Mittie, passed away as well from typhoid. In Roosevelt's diary entry for February 14, 1884, he wrote only, "The light has gone out of my life." After completing his term in legislature, the distraught Roosevelt left to live in the North Dakota Badlands, throwing himself into the rough life on the frontier. He left his sister Anna to care for his daughter. In these years, Roosevelt exchanged his urbane lifestyle for a new rough and adventurous one. In 1886, Roosevelt returned to the east to his house which had been built on Oyster Bay called Sagamore Hill. He was remarried to Edith Crowe, a childhood friend of his, in December. With Edith, Roosevelt had 5 more children: Theodore Jr., Kermit, Archibald, Ethel, and Quinton. It was in 1888 that Roosevelt saw the opportunity to get back into politics. That year, he zealously campaigned for Benjamin Harrison in his search for the presidency. When Harrison won, he appointed Roosevelt to be a civil service commissioner. Here he became well known as a reformer, trying to clean up corruption in the civil services. In 1895, he took the post of police commissioner in New York City. There, he continued being a reformer by attempting to put an end to graft and corruption in the police force. As a police commissioner, he took control of the police department, reorganized it, fired corrupt policemen, and used to spend his nights walking through the city looking for policemen asleep on their jobs. In April of 1897, Roosevelt was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy as a reward for his tireless campaigning for the newly elected president, William McKinley. Theodore had been greatly affected by the logic of Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Now he could finally begin to put Mahan's beliefs into practice. Mahan had indicated several key points about the Navy. First, that the United States should develop a strong navy capable of extending its power across the ocean where it could defend U.S. interests at a safe distance from the home coastline. Neither Roosevelt or Mahan believed in the view that the U.S. coastal defense was the only use of the Navy. Also, if the Navy was going to be a world force, bases would have to be established in various locations, such as Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii. Roosevelt was also an avid supporter of expansion. He supported the U.S.'s need for an interoceanic canal, the ousting of Spain from Cuba, and thought that Spain's holdings in the Caribbean were an obstacle in the way of dominance of the Western Hemisphere. For these reasons, Theodore made contingency plans for war against Spain, which he would soon put to use. After the sinking of the Maine, Roosevelt had the opportunity to take advantage of Secretary of the Navy John D. Long's leave of absence. Along with other preparations for war, Roosevelt sent a message to Commodore George Dewey instructing him to fill his ships in Hong Kong with coal and, in the event of war with Spain, sail to the Philippines to prevent the Spanish from leaving. McKinley later described his Assistant Secretary of the Navy as a bull in a china shop. Although not supported by either Long or McKinley, these preparations greatly helped when the war did begin. As soon as the war started, Roosevelt left his post in the Navy to lead a cavalry unit. This unit would play a large role in the splendid little war that was the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt became Lieutenant Colonel of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, who became commonly referred to as the Rough Riders. This unit fought valiantly throughout the war and became famous for their bravery at Kettle Hill. Here they valiantly charged up the hill through the enemy forces to provide support for troops. After this, Roosevelt led troops in successfully attacking San Juan Hill. No one did as much to advance his political career during the war as did Theodore Roosevelt. His popularity was reflected in his being elected as the new governor of New York in the fall of 1898. He had rose from Assistant Secretary of the Navy to governor of an important state in the span of a year. Republican politicians were concerned about him becoming too popular because they were against his unorthodox practices. A way to eliminate Theodore Roosevelt, they thought, was to make him McKinley's vice president, which they did in 1900. But 6 months into McKinley's second term, McKinley was shot by an anarchist and died. And so began the presidency of 42-year-old Theodore Roosevelt, the person who had grown from a feeble young boy to one of the most powerful men in all of the world.